Cissy Houston remembered it was exactly 11:15 when she hung up the phone. Her daughter's voice had never sounded so fragile, so distant. "Mom, it's so quiet tonight," Whitney had said, and those words squeezed the heart of Cissy, an experienced gospel singer. Her 48 years of maternal instinct were sounding alarms, but she was 3,000 miles away. She knew she couldn't reach her daughter, who was in Los Angeles for Grammy Week, couldn't hold her. Just 5 hours after that phone conversation, Whitney Elizabeth Houston's heart would stop in room 434 of the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and one of the most powerful voices in music history would be silenced forever. But that night, the words Whitney spoke to her mother during that last phone call, words never shared with anyone else, would remain the Houston family's darkest secret. If this story is going to touch you deeply too, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to tell you reveals the unknown face of Whitney Houston's final hours and the tragedy that unfolded behind that famous Grammy night in all its raw truth. The beginning of silence. When Whitney Houston arrived in Los Angeles on Thursday, February 9, 2012, the team greeting her at the airport was concerned about the change in the legendary singer's physical appearance. The woman who once sparkled under stage lights, who mesmerized audiences with her 5-octave vocal range, now walked with tired steps, the legendary sparkle in her eyes replaced by a deep sadness. She was going to attend Clive Davis's traditional pre-Grammy party, but everyone noticed that Whitney Houston was no longer her old self. That evening, when she checked into the Beverly Hilton Hotel, the receptionist Maria Gonzalez would say years later in her statement, "I had known Whitney Houston for years. Every time she came to the hotel, she would radiate amazing energy around her. But that night was different. It was like she was carrying her own shadow on her shoulders." That night around 11 o'clock, Whitney called her mother from her hotel room. Cissy Houston was watching television at her home in New Jersey when the phone rang, and seeing her daughter's name made her anxiety grow even more. Whitney had been calling at irregular intervals for days, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes just staying silent on the phone. This time her voice was trembling, and Cissy could feel her daughter was crying. "Mom, everything is so different here," Whitney began. "People look at me but they don't see me. They're just looking for the person I used to be. I'm not that anymore, Mom. That voice is gone." Cissy tried to calm her daughter, spoke encouraging words, but Whitney's response was chilling. "It's so quiet tonight, Mom. The music inside me has gone silent. There's only emptiness." The story of the lost voice. The decline in Whitney Houston's voice had actually begun years earlier. The turbulent period during her marriage to Bobby Brown, her struggle with substance addiction, and constant touring stress had slowly destroyed that magnificent instrument. But no one knew that in her final months, Whitney was terrified of completely losing her voice. Her close friend and vocal coach Gary Katona detailed the vocal crises the singer experienced in her final period in a statement he made after Houston's death. "Whitney would call me and say, 'Gary, my voice is gone. I can't find the notes.' I would try to calm her down, but we both knew that the voice once described as the eighth wonder of the world was now just an echo." On Friday, February 10, the day before her death, Whitney had tried to rehearse in the afternoon with Brandy, Monica, and Clive Davis. Those present say that when Houston picked up the microphone, her hands were shaking, her voice broke on the first notes, and her eyes filled with tears. Clive Davis, in an interview years later, described that moment. When Whitney approached the microphone, she looked timid, like a small child. When she began the first notes of "I Will Always Love You," there was a deep silence in the room. Everyone was waiting for that magical moment, but the voice that came wasn't Whitney Houston. It was just a shadow, a pale reflection of a beautiful memory. The last night and secret visitors. Saturday, February 11, Whitney's last day, had actually started quite actively. Around 9 in the morning, breakfast had been served to her room. Whitney had eaten only a piece of bread and left her orange juice half finished. The room service attendant noticed that the singer kept looking out the window and talking to herself. Around 11 o'clock, a mysterious visitor came to Whitney's room. Although hotel security footage doesn't fully show this person's identity, it was determined to be a tall, well-built man who stayed for about 45 minutes. After this visit, guests in the neighboring room heard loud music coming from Whitney's room and the singer trying to sing her own hit songs. But this voice was no longer that legendary Whitney Houston voice. Around 2 in the afternoon, when Mary Jones, who had been Whitney's assistant for many years, entered the room, she found the singer crying in the bathroom. Whitney was looking in the mirror and repeating, "Who is this woman, Mary? I don't know this woman." Mary tried to calm her boss, but the emptiness in Whitney's eyes frightened her. Years later, when Mary described that moment, she would say, Whitney seemed disconnected from her own existence. She wasn't seeing herself in the mirror, but someone else. Maybe what she saw was the person she used to be, but no longer was. Clive Davis's secret. Around 3 o'clock, Clive Davis called Whitney. The famous producer was worried about the evening party. Davis, who knew Whitney's condition, didn't want the singer to perform, but Houston insisted. The phone conversation lasted about 20 minutes, and the only sound heard from Whitney's room was occasional bursts of sobbing. Davis would say years later about this conversation, "Whitney promised me she would just attend the party, said she wouldn't go on stage, but there was a farewell in her voice, as if we were talking for the last time. I wish I could have listened to that voice." Around 3:30, Whitney called her mother again. This time the conversation was very short, just 3 minutes. Cissy Houston says her daughter's voice was calmer, but she felt something strange. Whitney had told her mother, "I love you, Mom, thank you for everything," and hung up. Cissy had wanted to say, "Wait, Whitney, what's happening?" at that moment, but the phone had already been disconnected. This would be the last conversation between mother and daughter. Ray J in the final hours. Around 4 o'clock, Ray J, who Whitney was dating at the time, came to the room. The young singer wanted to cheer Whitney up by playing her the new songs he had written, but the scene he found shocked him. Whitney was sitting in the bathtub, fully clothed. The water wasn't running, the tub was dry. When Ray J asked what she was doing, Whitney just said, "I'm drowning, Ray, I can't breathe, but there's no water around." Ray J took his girlfriend out of the tub and laid her on the bed. Whitney's body temperature was low, and she was constantly shivering. Years later, in his statement, Ray J couldn't hold back his tears while describing those moments. "I had never seen Whitney like that. Her body was there, but her soul had already left. I wanted to help her, wanted to call a doctor, but she refused. She just said she wanted to be alone for a while. I wish I had never left her alone." Ray J left the room around 5 o'clock at Whitney's request. When he looked back one last time as he was leaving, Whitney was looking out the window with a sad smile on her lips. Bobby Christina's prophecy. Around 6 in the evening, Whitney called her 19-year-old daughter Bobby Christina. This conversation was perhaps one of Whitney's most emotional moments. Bobby Christina would later describe this conversation. "Mom kept telling me she loved me, as if she was saying it for the last time. I asked her, 'Mom, are you okay?' She said, 'Yes, baby, I'm just tired.' But there was something in her voice, a weight I couldn't describe. When I hung up, I felt a deep emptiness inside." The tragic thing is that 3 years later, almost on the same date as her mother's death, Bobby Christina would be found unconscious in a bathtub and would die after 6 months in a coma. It was as if mother and daughter's fate was woven with the same tragic ending. Bobby Christina's close friend says that after her mother's death, the young woman constantly said, "My mother is calling me, I need to go to her." Pat Houston's last meeting, around 7 in the evening, Whitney's sister-in-law and manager Pat Houston came to the room. Pat wanted to prepare Whitney for Clive Davis's party, but the scene she found worried her. Whitney was sitting on the bed, looking at old photo albums. Turning to Pat, she said, "Look, Pat, this is me at 17, before everything started. How happy I look, don't I?" Pat tried to cheer Whitney up, but the singer continued, "Sometimes I wish I had never become famous. If I had just stayed as Nippy singing gospel in church, maybe then I wouldn't have been so lost." Pat Houston refreshed Whitney's makeup and fixed her hair, but with every touch, she could feel how weak Whitney's body had become. At one point, Whitney held Pat's hand and said, "Promise me, Pat, you'll look after Bobby Chris. When I'm gone, you'll be a mother to her." Pat would never forget these words for the rest of her life, because it was as if Whitney was giving a farewell speech. The last bath and mysterious sounds. Around 7:30 in the evening, after Pat Houston left the room, Whitney went into the bathroom. She started filling the tub and poured bubble bath into it. The guest in the neighboring room later stated in their testimony that they heard Whitney trying to sing loudly. But this song wasn't any Whitney Houston song. It was a strange, unrecognizable melody and seemed to be sung in another language. The same guest noted that around 8 o'clock the singing suddenly stopped and there was a deep silence. Around 8:15, Monica, another of Whitney's assistants who wasn't with her that night, tried to call her boss. The phone was ringing, but no one was answering. Monica later said she had a strange feeling inside, as if Whitney was saying goodbye to her. At the same time, in New Jersey, Cissy Houston had suddenly woken up and started praying for her daughter. She would later say that at exactly that time she felt a deep pain in her heart, the moment of discovery. 3:36. The team who came to prepare Whitney for Clive Davis's party, noticing she hadn't come out of the room for a long time, knocked on the door. No answer. They tried several more times. Finally, hotel security was called, and the door was opened. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was lying motionless in the bathtub. The water was still warm, indicating not much time had passed. Resuscitation efforts began, but in vain. The world had lost one of the most powerful voices in music history. Detective Sarah Williams, one of the first police officers to arrive at the scene, years later described that moment. When I entered the room, there were Whitney Houston CDs and old photographs everywhere. It was as if she had been reviewing her own life. But what caught my attention most was a note written in lipstick on the bathroom mirror. Just one word: free. Whether this note was written by Whitney could never be definitively determined, but handwriting analysis showed a high probability it was hers. Clive Davis's party and tragic irony. The most tragic irony was that while Whitney's body was being removed from the hotel room, Clive Davis's party continued just 3 floors below. Many guests didn't yet know Whitney had died. During the party, when someone started playing Whitney's "Where Do Broken Hearts Go?", Clive Davis was seen crying. At that moment, he had just received the news. While everyone in the room was trying to understand what was happening, Davis took the microphone and said with a trembling voice, "Our party has ended tonight. We've lost Whitney." Alicia Keys was there that night and was one of the first artists to hear the news of Whitney's death. Years later, describing that moment, she said, "Everyone was in shock. No one could believe it. Whitney had died just a few floors above, and we were having a party here. It was the most surreal and sad moment of my life." Many guests left the hotel crying. Some tried to go up to the floor where Whitney's room was, but police wouldn't allow it. The funeral and final journey. On February 18, 2012, the funeral service held at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark was like a farewell concert. Cissy Houston couldn't hold back her tears at her daughter's casket. Kevin Costner, speaking at the ceremony about the days they filmed The Bodyguard together, had everyone in the room crying. In his speech, Costner said, "Whitney was always someone who needed protection, but we couldn't protect her." That magnificent voice actually came from a very fragile heart. As Alicia Keys sang a gospel song Whitney loved, her voice trembled. Dionne Warwick couldn't believe her niece was gone. But perhaps the most touching moment was when Cissy Houston addressed her daughter one last time. "Baby, you're not in pain anymore. Your voice may be silenced forever, but you've joined the angels' chorus. Rest in peace, Nippy." What remains an eternal silence. After Whitney Houston's death, Hotel Room 434 remained sealed for a while. It was later redecorated, but hotel employees still claim they occasionally hear strange sounds from that room, as if someone is singing. Whether it's real or a collective imagination is unknown, but cleaning staff working on that floor of the Beverly Hilton are reluctant to enter that room alone. Cissy Houston, in the book she wrote after her daughter's death, never fully revealed the details of that last phone conversation. She only said, "Whitney's last words were a secret and will remain so, but know that my daughter was searching for peace, and I hope she finally found it." 91-year-old Cissy Houston, who passed away in 2024, was buried next to her daughter and granddaughter, Bobby Christina. 3 generations of Houston women were now together in eternal rest. Bobby Brown, in a statement years later about his ex-wife's death, said, "We destroyed each other, but our love was real." Whitney being alone in her final days still tears me apart. I wish I could have been there. Maybe everything would have been different. While many interpreted Brown's words as sincere regret, some thought it was a belated confession. Diane Sawyer's hidden truth. 2 years before Whitney Houston's death, in 2009, her interview with Diane Sawyer was actually much longer than the version that aired. Only 45 minutes of the approximately 4-hour recording was broadcast. Diane Sawyer, in an interview years later, partially revealed Whitney's words spoken off camera that were never aired. At one point, Whitney looked at the camera and said, "Diane, I'm dying. Something inside me is fading a little more each day. Sometimes when I wake up in the morning, I have trouble remembering who I am." Sawyer had decided not to air these words because Whitney's vulnerability at that moment was too deep to be shown on screen. In the unaired portions of that interview, Whitney had also described the first time she used crack cocaine. "It was the 3rd year of my marriage to Bobby. One night after a party, Bobby said to me, 'This will relax you.' I said no, but he insisted. Finally I tried it, and in that moment Whitney Houston died. Someone else took her place. That other person was the version of myself I hated." Diane Sawyer says that during this confession, Whitney cried so much that her makeup ran and they had to take a half-hour break from filming. Oprah Winfrey's last intervention. There was a detail no one knew. Oprah Winfrey had secretly called Whitney Houston just a week before her death on February 4, 2012, and suggested they meet in Los Angeles. Oprah had noticed the change in Whitney's voice and was concerned. "Whitney, I want to see you. Let's have coffee," Oprah had said. But Whitney refused. When Oprah insisted, "Maybe I can help you, I know some doctors," Whitney's response was sharp. "It's too late, Oprah. Some things can't be fixed. Like a broken vase, even if you gather my pieces, it won't be the same." After this phone conversation, Oprah Winfrey called Whitney's manager, Pat Houston, and expressed her concerns. She told Pat Houston, "Get her hospitalized. She needs professional help." But Pat knew Whitney would never accept this. At Whitney's funeral, Oprah blamed herself in her speech, saying, "I wish I had insisted that day. I wish I had gone to Los Angeles and forcibly taken her to the hospital." Kevin Costner's last message. Kevin Costner, her partner in the Bodyguard film, had sent Whitney a message 3 days before her death. The words in the message deeply affected everyone when found on Whitney's phone. "Whitney, you're still my princess that I need to protect. Please take care of yourself. Remember, you're not just a voice, you're a miracle. Love, Kevin." Whitney never replied to this message. Costner later said he received a notification that Whitney had read the message, but when no reply came, he felt a deep concern inside. In his speech at the funeral, Costner said while describing the day he first met Whitney, "When Whitney came to the studio, there was an invisible light around her. That light went out over the years, and I just watched. I wish I could have found a way to rekindle that light. But some stars burn in their own light and eventually turn to ash. Whitney was such a star." The last concert disaster. On February 8, 2012, just 3 days before Whitney's death, what happened when she went on stage at Kelly Price's birthday party was actually much more dramatic than what was reported to the public. When Whitney went on stage, her hands were shaking so much holding the microphone that sound technician John Matthews had to attach the microphone to the stand. When she started singing "Jesus Loves Me," her voice completely broke on the first note. Everyone in the room was shocked. Whitney closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried again. This time she could get out a few notes, but then went into a coughing fit. Musician David Foster, who was there that night, described what happened. "I'll never forget the expression on Whitney's face. It was as if a surgeon had lost his hand or a painter had gone blind. She looked at the microphone and the words 'I'm sorry' fell from her lips. Then she left the stage. We tried to console her backstage, but she was just crying. 'My voice is gone. Everything is gone,' she kept repeating. Final word. The echo of silence. Whitney Houston's life will be remembered as one of the brightest rises and most tragic falls in music history. But perhaps the most painful truth wasn't how that magnificent voice was buried in silence, but the loneliness Whitney experienced in her final days. A woman with millions of fans, who had won countless awards, who had written her name in music history in golden letters, took her last breath alone in the cold bathtub of a hotel room. The words, "Mom, it's so quiet tonight," that she said to her mother in that last phone conversation, were perhaps the deepest cry of Whitney's inner world. The loneliness she felt, despite being surrounded by people, showed the dark side of success and fame. It's said that Cissy Houston could never forget these words and heard her daughter's voice in her dreams every night. Today, when Whitney Houston's songs play, that 5-octave miraculous voice still touches people's hearts. But now we know that behind that voice were unhealed wounds, unspoken words, and unfulfilled dreams. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was silenced at 48, when she still had many songs to sing. But perhaps her greatest tragedy was that the person who silenced her was herself. Room 434 at the Beverly Hilton Hotel is now used as a normal hotel room, but some nights, especially on February 11, hotel employees say they hear a faint melody in the corridors of that floor, as if someone, from very far away, is singing "I Will Always Love You" in a muffled voice. Whether it's real or imagination is unknown. But Whitney Houston's legacy continues to live not only in the songs she left behind, but also in the deep silence created by her absence. And perhaps that silence in Whitney's last words was actually the echo of a scream that hasn't yet subsided.